This very well-written book places the sisters within the context of Canadian religious, education, women's, and social history. The story is also placed within the larger contexts of events taking place in Canada and the larger Catholic Church. All in all, it is a fine study of how a religious community has ministered in Canada since 1898.
Theoretically grounded in works drawn from fields including theology and critical theory, this work raises many questions that members and friends of the congregation, as well as scholars of religion, organizational behavior, sociology, theology, history, and gender studies can reflect upon.
With her robust combination of theory, archival research, and oral interviews, Dr. Bruno-Jofre has made a major contribution not only to the history of women religious, but to the histories of prairie education, Catholicism, and feminism. Her integration of the often separated areas of education, religion, immigration, and gender is a model for scholars in any of these fields.
This is an excellent study of the work of the Sisters of Our Lady of the Missions in Canada from 1898 until 2008. It is an outstanding contribution to the growing corpus of work on female religious institutions around the world. Throughout, readers are captivated by a most engaging account of the congregation's work, particularly the embrace in recent years of eco-spirituality, the celebration of what it is to be a woman, and social justice.
I think of this new history of the Sisters of Our Lady of the Missions in Canada in terms of seeds. It seems an apt metaphor for a story about women on the Canadian prairies. It was the leadership team of Denise Kipe, Sandra Stewart, and Christina Cathro who had the seed of an idea to produce an updated history. They entrusted that seed to me. I found some people who graciously agreed to serve on a committee, one of whom was missionary oblate Sister Dora Tatro, who suggested Rosa Bruno-Jofre as a possible author. I approached Rosa with the seed of a project. Rosa accepted the seed, planted, watered, and weeded that seed with great attention, care, and scholarly rigor. The rest, as they say, is history. In this case, a history of the Sisters of Our Lady of the Missions in Canada. This newly published book will now be going out into the world and will land in diverse contexts, diverse soils. The process of sowing goes on. The theologian Yves Congar says, "The future is prepared in the waiting, when the seed, once deposited, puts forth a shoot and grows. What is essential is to have sown a seed." I believe that Rosa Bruno-Jofre has sown this seed with remarkable care, insight, and scholarship, and the result is this book.
My gratitude to all who made this book possible, to the sisters for their openness to a secular historian, and to the oblate Sister Dora Tetro, who could not participate in the video, but helped me immensely in this process. This book guides the reader through the journey taken by the Canadian province of the Religieuses Notre Dame de Mission, Sisters of Our Lady of the Missions. It starts with the establishment in Manitoba, Canada in 1898 by invitation of the Ultramontane Archbishop of St. Boniface, Adelard Langevin, and ends with 2008, when the congregation as a whole at the international level redefined its vision and mission as the RNDM Earth Community, We Are One, We Are Love. This new vision was framed within eco-spirituality in a new cosmology, the celebration of womanness and a commitment to social justice. I conducted archival research at the Centre de Patrimoine in St. Boniface, Winnipeg, Manitoba, at the General Archives of the Congregation in Sterry, England, and at the RNDN House in Rome. This research was funded by an inside grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The congregation came to life in Lyon, France in 1861 at the intersection of ultramontanism and colonialism, and was founded by Euphrasy Barbier at the time of the Holy See's anti-modernist and anti-liberal positioning. The new congregation, originally devoted to the education of young girls and women in infidel countries, carved out a space for itself in the colonial empire. At the center of its mission, there were notions of salvation and redemption that configured the other, while it also converged with the state agendas. In the field, a great deal of their work was with settlers. Barbier had developed her own religious self under the influence of a rigorous version of Jansenism, which led her to the practice of self-sacrifice and acceptance of suffering. She emphasized the negation of the self, made the congregation semi-cloistered, cultivated loyalty to Rome, and set a strong authoritarian tone with an accent on obedience and limited contact with the world. These all set clear parameters for the relational and reflective dimensions of the self. In line with this vision, she built a highly centralized, hierarchical, and bureaucratic organization. The congregation had a Trinitarian inspiration, but as RNDM Sister Susan Smith explains, it needs to be understood in relation to a Tridentine Catholicism, which institutionalized the projection of the Spirit in the progression from God to Christ to Church, the Church mediated. And it was consolidated by neo-scholasticism, thus controlling the notion of radical freedom of the spirit. When the congregation came to the province of Manitoba, Canada, the sister had already established an international network of houses in Europe, Asia, and Oceania. Once in Canada, the RNDM soon expanded their educational work to Saskatchewan in 1905, and later to Ontario in 1940, and to Quebec in the 1950s. They taught in public schools, parish schools, private schools, and in the publicly funded Catholic separate school system in Saskatchewan. The RNDMs thus secure their own place in the educational state. The RNDMs were involved in the residential schools for Indigenous children for 17 months. The sisters' aim was assimilation and conversion of the children, a negation of their inner self. Meanwhile, the sisters, a large number of them Canadian, would develop their own identity working with settlers, French Canadians, European immigrants, and English-speaking Catholics. Life in the prairies, full of spontaneity and challenges to the rule, is narrated in the many testimonies and journal notes from the sisters. The RNDM sisters were fully integrated with the communities. In the end, I argued that the congregation was a component of a major attempt on the part of the church to place itself in the educational state in formation. It aimed to keep among Catholics an adherence to a worldview and a doctrine grounded in a neo-scholastic theological framework, one that confronted modernity and tried to assert a Catholic way of being. Thus, the book seeks to convey the unique characteristics of the various settings. In Manitoba, these were the schools in Franco-Manitoban communities, the parish and private schools in English-speaking communities, and the work with children of immigrants. In Saskatchewan, these were the Catholic separate system, the private schools for girls, including at higher levels of education, and more than a year in a residential school for Indigenous children. And there were the settings of Ontario and Quebec. The 1930s opened a challenging period for the congregation, but the post-war era and the long 1960s, with its overlapping socioeconomic and theological logical shifts, would introduce a new landscape and lead to radical breaks. The RNDM's private schools for girls did not survive the changes. The RNDMs, along other teaching congregations, have had a relevant role in building the identity of what Marcel Martel called the French-Canadian nation, which included Quebec and communities outside Quebec. In the 1960s, the movement away from the pursuit of a common identity for all French Canadians created a new political and educational scenario. The sisters belonging to the Canadian province had developed their own sense of being RNDM religious. The mission in Peru, an initiative of the province that started in the field in January 1969, had moved them to resignify their understanding of mission, transforming their sense of identity as missionary sisters. They became familiar with liberation theology. The process of reception of Vatican II Council, and the Council went from 62 to 65, would in fact lead to epistemic shifts and visionary changes, often truncated. This was a difficult process in which residual elements and fear of change coexisted with more radical approaches. The Canadian province played a leading role in the process of renewal that moved from questioning hierarchies in the congregation through a strong commitment to social justice to a new cosmology. The congregation as a whole embraced social justice in 1984. However, the adoption of eco-spirituality represented the most powerful break. The sisters moved beyond the boundaries of the modern self to resituate themselves in relation to the universe and the human and non-human world. The province played an inspiring role in the late 1990s and early 2000s. In 2008, the International Congregation as a whole formalized the concept of the RNDM Earth Community. We are one, we are love. The latter a phrase taken from the founder. The sisters of the province had developed an understanding of themselves as individuals and as a community grounded in a critique of Western cosmology and in ways to respect and revere the interiority and differences of others. The Canadian province recognized the parallels between the scientific insights of the new cosmology, the wisdom of indigenous cultures, and the insight of major world religions. I took a new direction in writing this history, one often wrapped in a Catholic idiom. The book offers a pinch of critical realism in its attempt to understand, grounded in Quentin Skinner's theory, the intentionality sustaining the educational apostolate and the adaptation to changes. The text and the oral histories, in this case imbued with confessional motivations, are placed in an interplay of macro and micro contexts, while exploring configurations of ideas and practices in the spaces where the sisters inhabited and interacted. The exploration of the semantic fields has been used in examining the place of the congregation at the intersection with theological, logical configurations and the patriarchal church. Hopefully, This book will enrich the understanding of the workings of women teaching congregations previous to Vatican II and provide insights about the new directions taken by women within the confines of hierarchical and exclusive institutional church.
Well, I'll start us off. And I was struck by what Liz and Heidi read, and what I read was the kind of the areas that this story encompasses. You know, gender studies and educational history, and it's sort of moving beyond a very traditional, very focused look at a congregation, and it's placing that congregation in such a broad context. And because everything I know about Canadian women religious, I learned from Liz, Heidi, and Rosa. It's been really helpful to me to see it in that broader context, and to get to understand that better.
So can I pick up on that and just say to Maggie, so Maggie, what do you see that makes the Canadian context different from the American one?
Well, I mean, in many ways, they're very similar, of course. You know, I mean, the prairies, you know, or plains or whatever. And that's one thing that's so interesting about it. But the other thing that's so interesting about it is looking at how congregations in these two countries adapt from their European model. And some of that is tied up with your system of education works a little bit differently than ours. Some of it doesn't have anything to do really with women religious. It has to do with other things. It's just interesting to see those contexts and how things play out. And the idea that, you know, not all women religious are not all the same. The uniqueness of the congregation is important too.
For me, it was a challenge to situate in a macro context and coming back to the micro, interacting the macro with the micro. And I had more than one micro context. I had the institutional church. I had the Holy Sees and its policies. I had the general aid. I have at the micro level, I have the congregation, but I also, the province, but I also had the Catholic bishops and so on and so on. Then it was a challenge. I think it was helpful to me that in my formation as historian in Argentina, I was a great deal under the influence of L'École de Sanal, which is now on fashion. Then I became very much aware of this, what we call now global history. And then I started to explore different concepts, not only conjuncture and longue durée and so on, but also different contexts like the macro and micro. And also I further developed the notion of configurations. And I integrated there the concept from Charles Taylor, the social imaginaries, because the social imaginaries of the community gave great deal of meaning to what the sisters did and how they integrated it into settings. It was a marvelous task, but I tell you, I work with 3,500 documents, as Sister Veronica knows, and that I use everything, but I have to connect, triangulate, compare, and so on, and 3 different archives.
Another aspect of the book was the international nature of the book. And I was curious if anyone could comment on what they took from that, what they noticed, and maybe relate it to their own experiences or research.
I could speak to that from a more personal aspect. I think what I appreciated most about the book was having a history, a larger history in which to make sense of my own beginnings in religious life, which was only 1980 that I was in the novitiate. So I needed to understand the 70s better. I needed to understand the 80s and 90s, because religious life was already in a mode of deconstruction, if you like, but something new was emerging.
But I found it difficult. When I first entered, the provincial said to me, you're either being asked to be a teacher or we're being asked to consider other kinds of ministry. And because I entered as a medical lab technologist, I was not a teacher. And so like, where was my place in this? And so to understand that larger, what was happening in the church, what was happening in the congregation, even internationally, I did not enter, in my mind, an international congregation. I thought I was entering a Canadian one. But really, we were at the cusp re-owning our international flavor in the 70s and 80s. So it was a real challenge to me personally, and one that I'm glad I stuck with. But I didn't enter it because it was international. So there was all this new stuff happening, and Rosa's book helped me to, just turn on some lights for me that made that personal journey a little more accessible to me. So that would be both the meaning and something around that international flavor that you were leading us to there.
Well, I was just thinking how we really do need to know about the 70s, 80s, and 90s in all of this, and how important that is. And Liz and Heidi might want to jump in here, but a lot of congregations aren't really ready to let you look at the 70s, 80s, and 90s yet. I mean, a lot of archives in general, and I think the four of us are all itching to get back into archives sometime this summer with any luck. So I think that's really important, that is a really critical piece to these stories. And we know they're critical. We know those decades are critical, but we don't always have access to the material from those decades.
Mm-hmm.
So I was really resonating with that, Sandra.
I am very, very grateful to the congregation because the doors were open. And I had worked the long 60s, we call the long 60s following Marwick, before in dealing with history, other historical issues, and so on, the young people and so on. The question is to have access. And I had full access, full responses to my questions. And this is a very, very beautiful. Somebody who is not here, but who was very helpful to me was Marilyn LeBlanc. And sometimes the questions a historian poses are not very easy in terms of responding in emotional terms. They are not easy. And the experience in Peru was a difficult one, but such an enriching experience for the sisters. And I had been fortunate too that I live in Peru in that particular, I live in Peru for a couple of years. And then I was familiar with the reforms and the situation at that particular moment.
I've been eager to comment. This is an earlier question. What's most remarkable about the book for me is the level of access that Rosa had. Obviously, the trust, the two-way trust is really, I think, unprecedented. The book reads as if Rosa was welcomed to see anything she asked for, and that's unusual. It's really unusual. A lot of credit goes to the congregation for trusting Rosa, and of course a lot of credit goes to Rosa for taking that so seriously. And Rosa this is Rosa's approach, but her as an individual, she is a very honest. She probably couldn't have written a book otherwise, and I think ethics are far too high, far too extensive for her to have worked with a congregation who didn't allow this. It seems like a wonderful combination. I think the book is of the very highest quality. I'm very proud of Rosa. I looked at it again today, and I'm so excited to use it alongside my own work because it's opened doors for me to knowledge, and I'll never be half as good as Rosa with theory. She's remarkably good at theory and just has such a broad starting point with both her depth of analysis and her theory. We know she loves Bordeaux and she loves Charles Taylor. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful book, Rosa.
One of the things that strikes me as well is this ability to weave through all these different contexts and temporalities, but still get a clarity in the history is very striking. I'm going to turn it to Liz, because Liz, I saw you do this, so I assume you have something to say maybe on the theory. Here you go.
I just want to pick up on what both Heidi and Maggie said. One of the most remarkable elements of the book is Appendix A. And Appendix A is entitled Making Sense of Memories, a Conversation Among Former Provincials, a Literal Transcription. And I want to speak directly to the congregational leadership here. That is a remarkable, remarkable document. And as a historian, thank you so much for allowing that to become part of this manuscript. That itself is a fabulous primary source. And I would like you to take this to the International Union of Superiors General and hold it up and say, this is what we're doing in the Canadian province. And can you folks can you women, folks too, because I want the men to do it too. Can you take a look at this and see how important it is to have these reflections, these first person narratives included and to become part of the public discourse. So thank you so much to the leadership team for doing that. And please take my thanks back to the rest of the members of your team.
It was really interesting, the process in the 60s, beginning of the 70s, the interaction between the province, the Generalate, and the Vatican. And this is when I use the concept of film in Bourdieu's sense. But it was fascinating, the assertiveness of the province, how they responded, for instance, to the cardinal who came with a very chauvinist kind of aesthetic sense of women religious. In the various exchanges, one point or another, I am a bit out of chronologically, the sisters assert themselves as Canadians. We are Canadians, and this is why, and I found this fascinating, and how they construe their sense of Canadianism. No, that was a fascinating moment for me, to explore that part.
I was struck, and I know it's not unique, but I was still struck by how much it appeared in the story, the whole missionary idea. What do you sign on for when you want to be a missionary, and how do you define missionary? And I'm always struck in religious congregations, and again, south of your border, when they say, yes, we began a mission in Pakistan and 200 of us volunteered, but only 4 could go, And I think, oh my gosh, yeah, how were they going to get 200 people out of the parochial schools in the Bronx and into Pakistan? And I was really struck with that. I guess because of the prairie connection too, that starts in one way as missionaries and ends as missionaries another way. And how I just thought Rosa did a very nice job of, that's not even strong enough, an excellent job of kind of showing that shift and the stories of the sisters and the, kind of add it to that.
It is fascinating that the 60s were the times of Cuernavaca. I work in Illich a lot. I have finished a book with John a few days ago. Will be published by University of Toronto Press. Then it was a time when mission was resignified. And Ivan Illich had published at one point The Seamy Side of Charity. And one of the sisters had told me they received the reports from Cuernavaca, from the Illich centers. A great number of the sisters stop in Cuernavaca, and it's not the case of the RNDMs. But it was a very fascinating time in which the North American hierarchy and some Canadians work together with the US, the Alliance for Progress, to stop communism and to stop the expansion of Protestantism. And then at the same time converse with the Vatican, and came in 1961, we had the papal invitation, the call to all the congregations to send 10% of their membership to Latin America. The year before, the Pope had created the Pavla, the papal volunteers. Then it was a very peculiar environment. And then at the same time, you have in the South, many of the Catholic bishops, I will name two, like Calder Camara, there was another bishop by the name Piñera, who is related to the current president, who is on the right, by the way, not on his uncle. Then it's the Catholic bishop responding in a contesting way, many of the Catholic, and remember Selam and the Medellin document. Then it was a liberation theology growing for a few decades and taking shape in the book of Gustavo Gutierrez, the Peruvian. Then it is a very particular context that we need to consider here.
Okay. It's old.
Real.
I really appreciated your comments too about the openness to archives and the different modalities like the art and the poetry and stuff that are in Rosa's book. I mean, I never really thought of that before, but it's important to know. And we never thought of doing it otherwise than giving you full access, Rosa. And you were trustworthy. We knew that you were trustworthy, and we trusted you, and you trusted us, and we were off to the races.
Yeah,
I would like to say too that as one of the leaders who's part of that Appendix A, your affirmation of that being part of the book, and my realization in listening to you that already one of those women has passed on.
Yes.
He's
yes.
no longer with us. And also, I think realizing that in my story in the congregation, I entered in the 60s at the beginning of that tumultuous period, what I experienced as tumultuous, that I was living with women who were very close to the origins and didn't realize then how important that would be for me at this age. Just their wisdom and their stories from those. They were very close to the beginning. So I regret that really, but yeah. So I too am. I'm very grateful that we've been able to do this now.
I thank you for letting me include that, because when I asked permission, I thought, well, you were so open to me. It was incredible that you allowed me to include that. Yeah.
Yeah. Reading Rosa's book was a visceral experience for me. I was taken back to gut-wrenching personal conversations and assemblies when the struggles of competing worldviews, different understandings of church, authority, mission, caused hurt and sometimes ruptured relationships. I was struck that the journey from our ultramontane origins to where we are today is in and of itself a missionary journey, as perilous as the journey of the first 4 sisters who came from France to the very sparse conditions of Grande Clairière. Rosa's work captures well the complexities of our RNDM history in the world and church. At the end of my reading, all I could say was, there has to have been a power greater than ourselves at work throughout this history. And I'm very glad that we have come to the place, or evolved, to understand ourselves as active participants in the divine missions, and that we are cooperating with those divine missions in creating an earth that will flourish as God has dreamed. So thank you, Rosa, for reflecting our lives back to us. Thank you.
Rosa's book was very moving and explanatory of what was happening in our history at the time of my novitiate in 1980. I found new words and a larger picture in which to make meaning of my experience. Rosa writes, the congregation was opened to embrace difference. In 1997, I came out to the community as a celibate lesbian religious, to which the sisters responded in general with openness, acceptance, and love amidst some obvious fear. Rosa reflects this ever-opening energy throughout the book, noting that the process of change in the congregation shows a liberating intended force, which I call God Trinity. The sisters' openness was a door I needed to walk through to another level of my own story and identity as an RNDM and as a woman in the church. How wonderful it is to evolve. The book is a celebration of this truth for me. We are always evolving, and we are always accompanied. Thank you so much, Rosa.